love, too sexy for my love, love's going to leave.
Okay, and on that most inauspicious note, let's take a look at Supreme Court. This is actually an old photograph, so some of these people are too sexy to be alive or on the court, in fact, but certainly too sexy for their robes, and I'm sure that the current Supreme Court justices of the United States are much the same. I'm going to take a quick overview of the court system itself, very quick, and then mainly focus on the Supreme Court. This is a pretty limited course in terms of scope, and the Supreme Court, although that's a tiny portion of the U.S. judicial system, it's the one that gets the most press and probably has certainly the most case-by-case impact. So, very quick overview. The purpose of the court is to interpret the law. What does it mean? What's legal? What's not? Sometimes it's pretty obvious. If a state law says you cannot walk up to someone and shoot them, and you're caught on camera walking up and shooting somebody, the courts will say what you did was not legal. But it gets an awful lot trickier when you start talking about more vague language like equal treatment and due process. What's the fair and right process? That's a lot trickier. We have different types of courts in the United States, and the main division to begin with is a criminal court versus a civil court. Now, a criminal court, you are charged by the government, be it the federal government, the state government, or a local government, of breaking a law. So that is a criminal court. And for this, you can face a penalty. You can be jailed. You can be fined by the city, fined by the state, fined by the federal government, etc. And then there are also civil cases. This is an individual or party, person, individual, group, company, etc., being sued for causing damage. There are no jail penalties for this. You can't be sent to jail or to prison if you lose in a civil court, but you can be held liable for the costs related. And this is only monetary, as said. In terms of levels of the court, first of all, you need to stop the video for a second and ask yourself, federalism. What is federalism? Most of you can answer this, but to make sure, stop the video. What is federalism? And the answer is, of course, it's a separation of powers between the national government and the state and local governments. In the United States, throughout its history, sometimes the national governments had more power, sometimes less power, but it's definitely understood that they all have their own individual powers. And the way this plays out in the courts is that we do have a federal court system. And if you go, for example, to criminal court at a federal level, well, it's a federal crime. You've done something that is against U.S. law. You have committed treason. You have perhaps refused to. You've walked away, let's say, from an obligation. You haven't paid your federal taxes, etc., etc. The vast majority of court cases, crimes being tried, are not at the federal level. That's fairly rare. Far more at the state level. When you violate a felony at the state levels. Felony simply means a serious crime. What we've got here is, for example, murder laws are those are almost all state laws, unless you were to attack, let's say, a federal employee or something like that. Property theft laws, you break into someone's house, that's almost certainly going to be a state law. And then you've got the county or municipal, which is just a fancy way of saying city, court systems, and these tend to be local misdemeanors, violating a noise ordinance, lesser crimes that could lead to jail time, pretty unlikely to lead to prison time, at least in general. So we see that division where you see the different levels have different jurisdictions or different areas of control. You recall from the beginning of this course that Article 3 of the Constitution is all about the courts. And you might recall that it is a very, very short article. I mean, that Constitution goes on and on and on about, in Article 1, about the powers of Congress, the limits to Congress, has a fair amount of detail about the president. And the courts, well, it says very little. It does say there will be a Supreme Court. It says that. It says that these smaller courts, they call them inferior courts, but they mean less powerful, are set up by Congress. And it does say that Supreme Court justices rule for, quote, stay in power for terms of good behavior. In other words, it's more or less a lifetime appointment unless someone becomes sick or decides to resign or is, and in theory, taken out of power for violating their terms of office. But that's not, I don't believe that's ever happened with the Supreme Court justice, so that's very unlikely. Essentially, it's a lifetime appointment. The process, nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. So there is a little bit of a check and balance involved there. And this is true, by the way, of all the federal courts. Donald Trump has been able to appoint a number of federal courtships throughout the entire United States. Remember that at this point, the U.S. Senate is majority Republican, so it's pretty much been a rubber stamp. If he's appointed somebody, they have been. If he's nominated somebody, they've been appointed, confirmed by the Senate. How many on the court itself? Here's a good question for you. I think probably the best way to answer this question is in rhyme, through rhyme. Because you know what? The Supreme Court, the Constitution says nothing about the numbers. In 1789, and you see the dates here on the left. So let's just read this little poem and you can enjoy reading along with me. Congress decided at first to fix the number of justices at 6. But 12 years later, Congress planned on very much a change to 5, but the 6 remained very much alive. 1807, 6 high judges, supreme as heaven, and Jefferson added number 7. 7 high judges, all in the line, 2 more were added, and that made 9. 9 high judges were sitting when Lincoln made them an even 10. 10 high judges, very sedate, when Congress got through, there were only 8. 8 high judges who wouldn't resign, Grant brought the figure back to 9. And then at the bottom, would a justice feel like a packed sardine if the number was raised to, say, 15? In other words, Congress has changed the numbers of members of the Supreme Court, and what they're referring to in 1937 is that Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his second term, very popular president, said, I'm passing this New Deal legislation, it's helping people, but the Supreme Court, after all, made up of people that were appointed 15, 20, even 30 years earlier, they're calling major parts of my New Deal unconstitutional. Roosevelt asked Congress to add 6 more judges to the Supreme Court, who would all be appointed by him, who would be confirmed by a sympathetic Senate, and would allow him to get his legislation through the courts. This actually, by the way, was a huge mistake for Franklin Roosevelt, that even Roosevelt supporters, active New Dealers said, wait a minute, you know what? Roosevelt is trying to destroy the checks and balances here. Because what he's doing is trying to make the judicial branch pretty much a reflection of the executive branch. And of course, we've seen that in Bolivia in recent years, to be sure, as well. That idea of judicial independence, pretty important for a Montesquieu-based system of 3 separate branches of division of power. The federal courts have got one Supreme Court, again with 9 members at this point, and that's what the law says, and I don't see that changing anytime in the near future. You've also got what they call circuit courts, and these are federal appeal courts. In other words, and by the way, the Supreme Court is also, for the most part, an appeals court as well. In other words, if somebody doesn't like the decision, they can appeal it. And then below that, these are 3 judges, by the way, on each appeal court, so a 2-to-1 ruling would be enough to get an appeal of a case. Texas, I used to teach in Texas, so you don't care about that, but Texas, for example, is a part of that particular circuit or appeals course. And then you've got 94 district courses. This is original jurisdiction. If you violate a federal crime, you go to the local district court. If you are found guilty, you can attempt to appeal it in a federal appeals court, a circuit court. If you still don't get the answer that you want, you have the opportunity, but certainly not the right or the likelihood, to bring it all the way to the Supreme Court. And again, there's at least 1 in each state. The bigger states, of course, have got 4, 5, 6. I assume California probably has 7 or 8 district courts because of its population. This is simply the same information. You do not need to remember it, but it's a way of looking at it visually just for that purpose. And we won't talk about the claims court, the tax courts, the military courts, etc., or the state Supreme Courts or anything like that. So it's really just those other 3. That they exist is about all you need to know. And again, you see the state of Texas, 5 different areas. If you commit a crime in Austin, where I used to live, you would go to the Western District Federal Court. If it happened to be closer to Houston, the Southern District, etc. And here's where you see the circuit courts or the appeal courts. So if you are appealing a case that took place either in Mississippi or in Louisiana or Texas, you take it to the 5th appeals court. You'll notice that the 9th appeals court covers all of the West. You'll see the 10th court, etc. So basically it's geographically based. And again, if you wish to appeal a decision, you have the opportunity to do that. And then getting to the Supreme Court, there are 2 ways that can happen. It can go directly from a state Supreme Court, where the person who is not happy with the response can take a state Supreme Court ruling and ask it to be looked at by the U.S. Supreme Court. Or a federal district court can demand a writ of habeas corpus from a defendant who has tried all appeals within a state. It's far more common, I believe, the first path, that in effect somebody in most of the court cases you're looking at have already gone through their state court system to the state Supreme Court and then have been able to get the U.S. Supreme Court to look at it eventually. And you see, again, they would then go to a U.S. Circuit or Appeals Court and then to a Supreme Court, or the Supreme Court, because there is one. And again, you're just seeing the same thing here, but it makes a lot less sense, fewer words, and you get the idea here. So when does the Supreme Court hear a case? Well, first of all, the court itself is in session from October to June, so they have about an 8-month work year, about what a teacher has. You do not have a right to a Supreme Court hearing. In fact, usually it doesn't happen. One thing that has been ruled over the years, that a litigant, that is somebody who brings the court case to the Supreme Court, has to have what they call a standing to sue. And what that simply means is that it personally affects them. As an example, I as a male would not, let's say the state that I was in had just banned abortion. I would not be able to do this. The court would say, this does not directly affect you, Mr. Zeger. It would need to be a woman who could, in theory, have or be denied access to an abortion. Litigants, or the people wishing to bring this, must bring, and this is just fancy language, a writ of certiorari, and that simply means you're asking for a hearing. It's Latin, and simply is a detailed, this is why I'm bringing this case to the Supreme Court, this is the path we've gone, this is why I feel the Constitution of the United States is not being enforced in this particular case. As a general rule, it's called the Rule of 4, and understand that this is not written in the Constitution, but this is the way it's been. Of the 9 justices, 4 have to agree to hear the case. Now, this does not mean they've decided where they stand upon it, but it does mean that at least 4 judges have said, this seems to be a valid case. You know what? It seems to be an important case. This is not just some random thing that we're looking at here. This is something that I think the court is ready to take on because I think the country needs an answer. And know that there are politics involved in this. You might, for example, have a Supreme Court that is fairly heavily, let's say, pro-gun control at some point. And they might decide at this point, although judges are supposed to be impartial, you might find 4 justices of the Supreme Court saying, this might be a good time to look at this gun control ruling in Minnesota, because that could set a precedent for gun control legislation being allowed. But again, sometimes there are different reasons why judges will hear this. Again, the judges don't have to answer to anybody. If 4 justices, by the way, at the Supreme Court, they're called justices, but they're judges. That's all they are. They don't have to explain why. They simply have to say, we're not willing to hear this case. And a vast majority of the time, it's because we don't have time. These are long, complex cases, and as you'll see from the numbers, about 10,000, 8 to 10,000 requests are made every term, every one of these Supreme Court years, and maybe only about 100 are heard in any way, shape, or form. So if you were to say to somebody, that's it, I'll get you, I'll take you all the way to the Supreme Court, you probably won't, because the chances of the Supreme Court hearing your case are teeny, teeny, tiny. So here's the process. We have things called briefs. What those are is written reports and oral arguments from each side. By the way, others who are not directly prosecuting the case, let's say there's in that gun control case, there is an organization called Mothers Against Gun Violence. They might be able, they can write up an amicus curiae, a friends of the court statement that would be submitted to the judges, but they don't appear in courts themselves. Somebody else, let's say the National Rifle Association, well, they're not perhaps going to be trying the case before the court, but they would write an amicus curiae, a friend of the court document. Then we have the oral arguments, and these are the statements, and each side, if you can imagine this, gets 30 minutes. On your mark, get set, go. It can be a single lawyer talking. It can be a number of lawyers, each specializing in a certain area. It can be a first-hand witness. There's also then questioning from the Supreme Court justices. And often if you watch the court, the types of questions being asked by the justices often suggest what they're thinking about the case and where they're likely to vote. When they're making their decisions, what do the Supreme Court justices consider? Well, you know what answer number 1 is. Because it's the supreme law of the land, well, it's the Constitution. And if there is a clear, obvious violation of the Constitution, the state of Texas executes all people that wear toenail polish or something like that, and somehow it manages to get through the state of the Texas courts and all the way through the Texas Supreme Court, yeah, of course, the Supreme Court will say, I'm sorry, that's not equal protection, etc. But needless to say, always, the cases are not that obvious. But bottom line, they're supposed to look at what does the Constitution say. And then there's what we call precedents. And notice the PRE, which means before. What does it mean to precede something? It means to come before. These are past cases. And a good Latin term, stare decisis, which is let the decision stand. All things equal, and these judges are supposed to be experts in the law, and they have all the law books. They will say, well, look, I don't see a totally clear answer in the Constitution. What have past courts said at the Supreme Court level, even state courts for that matter? And all things equal, unless the judges see a compelling reason to make a change, they will simply say, you know what? We've already ruled on this case. We did it 40 years ago, 60 years ago, 20 years ago. Stare decisis. We don't see compelling reason to change that decision. However, there are some major cases in which that happens, in which there is a change, and then there is a new precedent. Probably one that you're familiar with or two. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 said, sure, any state can separate facilities by color, blacks here, whites there, as long as they're equal, which of course they never were. Well, for 58 years, that was the stare decisis move. Hey, the Supreme Court has already said segregating by race and color is just fine. In 1954, Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, the Supreme Court said, wait a minute, the courts have been getting it wrong. Here's the new precedent, and the powerful language of that case was separate is inherently equal, and we have a new precedent that would apply then to later cases. And of course, look, let's be real, how well written are the briefs? How good a lawyer, how good a speaker is the person, how convincing is she, how well does she answer the questions of the justices? Of course, that makes a difference. Now, the Constitution is supposed to matter more, but judges are, even with their incredibly sexy robes, judges are also human beings that get swayed by that as well. Comes to a decision. Again, you've seen your 30-minute on each side. Well, first of all, there have been, thousands of hours of time putting into writing the briefs, and the justices have spent a tremendous amount of time reading over them, and they have clerks that read all of these things, and all the stuff has happened. Then they have their 30 minutes on each side of argument, and then after the session is over, toward the end of the session, the judges officially vote and release statements. It's majority rule. So if you win 5-4, well, that is the new law of the land. Although, as you might imagine, let's say the gun control law from Minnesota is overruled 5-4. Boy, that's a close decision, and it does send a message to everyone, if a current justice dies and is replaced by somebody who's more pro-gun control, that could change. When you see an 8-1, 7-2, or certainly 9-0 ruling, that suggests that it's not going to change. By the way, a tie, it can happen. A judge resigns or dies, hasn't been replaced. There are also rare occasions where a Supreme Court justice might say, I used to work for that corporation being sued, and I need to recuse myself, so I'm not a part of it. In the event that there is a 4-4 tie, and that's happened in some cases, it reverts to what the lower court said, the case is done, and there's no change. Possibly, sometimes more important than the decision, or at least as important, are the written explanations. The courts don't just say, yeah, that law is fine, next. They have to explain their reasoning, and how they write them is tremendously important. They can be very brief. They can simply, yep, we ruled this way, there was no discussion, we understand this, or they can be multiple volumes of decisions with numerous decisions being written out. Why? Why did the court rule as it did? And it uses all this information, mentions the parts of the Constitution, other precedents, and also explains not just why it did what it did, but how widely this is going to be applied. Is it only gun control in the state of Minnesota? Is it only in that state, this particular law? Or the decision can be written in a way that says, you know what? This applies to basically all similar gun controls in all other parts of the country. Just a second. Seffi is interrupting me for a moment. Hi, Seffi. If we only had the Supreme Court in on this, I think we could solve it. Hold on, I'll put you on pause and move to the next one. Fatherhood. Let me write a poem to its joys. She's been a good kid. That's all right. There are 3 types of opinions. You might want to know this. The first is called the opinion of the court, and this is basically one justice. The Chief Justice, the guy in charge, as long as he is part of the majority, says, okay, this is the side we decided for. It's a 6-3 vote. I was on that side. Either I'm going to write the opinion or I will assign it to one of the other justices. And that's the official reasoning. We ruled in this way because of A, B, and C. And then there's also a concurring opinion. And to concur means to agree also. This is written by a different justice. In some case, there isn't one. Some case, there's an opinion of the court. It's 8-1. They're all pretty much there. But occasionally, you may see a justice that says, well, I also voted in the same way, but I had slightly different reasons for it. And I feel strongly enough about this that I wanted to write my own concurring opinion. So you might have one concurring opinion. You could have 3 or 4 concurring opinions. Again, they're part of the majority. And that would make sense if it's not a unanimous decision, and these days you never see a unanimous decision. These are dissenting opinions, and these would be written by a justice who says, I disagree with the majority. I think the court made the wrong decision, and here are the reasons behind it.